amongst all of Hiro Mishima's main cast members, I don't think any of them has a early starting point to far high up in the ranks kind of like development in terms of abilities as Lucy. And I'll give some examples because obviously like can't just say that without giving some context. For instance, I'll use Rebecca and Haru, one from Eden Zero, one from Wraith Master. We saw Rebecca get her ether gear. Like she didn't even have her ability until after she did a whole process of unlocking it. And I won't go into spoilers for specifics, but you know what I mean. Her unlocking her ether gear and being able to use it on command. Whereas Haru started out just getting his sword and getting the rave abilities and whatnot. But the difference between them and Lucy is a lot of the stuff for Rebecca, we did see her get initially, and then, you know, there was kind of like a gaining of a general grasp. There was a small training time skip of a month, and she was able to get a better hold on it. And then there was again, I don't think anyone's going to recover for specific dates of time that I mentioned for, I don't think it would be spoilers, but either way, I don't think anybody at this point would be that far behind. But the 3-year time skip, it just goes, it's like we saw her obtain it, but in terms of both points of experience that she gained are primarily around time skips, which isn't a problem, but it's just that we didn't see it entirely. And then Haru, though we did see Haru gain his swords, and as the story progresses, he eventually gains the Rive of Knowledge, and that would pretty much make so whenever he gets a new sword, he knows how to use it. So he, in context of the story, developed a way to pretty much skip over the learning process of some of his abilities and powers and stuff, because again, it made sense of how it was set up, but it is like it's a fair cheat kind of thing. Whereas Lucy, we do get stuff for Lucy, stuff like gaining critical magic, second origin and stuff, but for the most part, we do see the process of like how that happens and then the step-by-step as it goes. The only step for Lucy, before I even get into the match, because it's already been 2 minutes and I haven't even really talked about it, I just really wanted to kind of like build off of, where I want to set this at, because obviously like this is probably the hardest member of the main cast to kind of like go over in terms of combat and abilities, because Lucy's the only one that really is very majorly like a ranged caster, because Urza is a swordswoman, Natsu and Wendy are both Dragon Slayers, and Gray is Gray's always been, like, I don't even mention Gray's magic, but it's like Gray's always been like a primarily mid-range fighter who can get close range or do long range. But Lucy's the one that, outside like of specific star dresses, she is primarily a ranged character. She is a caster. Her greatest spell, Rhodometry, is a ranged, like, chanted spell. It's not the same as like Natsu's Purgatory Slashing Dragonfire, where he goes into uppercut somebody. But where I've been going with this, essentially, is that when you look at the growth of Lucy's abilities, you see the most of it out of any of the characters. And for example, like not the same thing, but it's an example of the only thing we really saw her skip over is gaining the ability to summon 1 gold key and 1 silver key. She went from 1 gold key to 2 gold keys, and then progressing into eventually being able to have 3 gold keys, and then Star Dress Mix, developing new versions of her spells. Like there's way more steps along for Lucy, and we only really skip that one, because we even see when she gains the ability to force closures. Like at the very beginning of the series, when she summoned her spirit, she couldn't make them go away. It was either she runs out of magic or the spirits leave themselves. And then it was in Galuna Island where she gained the ability to close the gate on them and say, all right, you just go home. It essentially would be like if you were, a Pokemon trainer with a Pokemon that didn't listen to you. And it's just like, not only that, do you remember like when was it Charizard? I can't remember if Ash had another Pokemon that would summon itself. It would just kind of like come out of its Pokeball. I can't remember off the top of my head. But it's like that, where it can screw you over. Or like Misty would with Psyduck, where it's like it could just screw you over by summoning the wrong one in a scenario. Maybe you mess up, or maybe the scenario changes, you have to switch to another one, and you couldn't do that because you couldn't make one leave. It was definitely, I'd say like for her magic, that's like the worst period. That's like the super training wheels like period of time. That'd be like being a slayer, like maybe at the very beginning, and you don't have resistances to your element, Like it may be like trying to eat fire, but it still is hot and it burns you a little bit. That would suck. That'd be like the part you just kind of have to deal with until you get to like the better portions. But anyway, where I'm going with this, besides, I was just trying to like lay out the idea, obviously, of Lucy's progress. But I'm going to be doing videos kind of going over fights and kind of talking about, one, the characters, where they're at in this fight, kind of like giving a idea of like, well, how powerful is, this main cast member, protagonist, whatever, versus antagonist, how powerful are they, and kind of gauging where their abilities are at the point of whenever their fight took place. And I'll do that briefly with Lucy, and just kind of mention where she was at in arcs leading up to this, and where Mimi should be sitting logically from the context of the story, and where it all makes sense. Because one thing is, like, Mimi is definitely the easiest to underestimate in the team for the Moonlight Divinities, and I'll go over that, because I think it makes sense of why people wouldn't expect Mimi to be as powerful as she actually is in terms of the story. But it is important, obviously, to understand how strong she actually is, so you know about, like, where Lucy's currently standing, because right now we're in the Dogromag Labyrinth, so battles are pretty much gonna be, like, the main focus of that arc, I would assume. So Lucy's strength is important, and it is relevant. There's like a weird thing with people when it comes to power levels, is they act like power levels don't matter to the point where in the story they don't pay as much attention. There's like a difference of just like straight talking about power levels and then knowing where power levels are in terms of the story, because obviously we need to know how strong Lucy is before she starts fighting Dragon Eaters potentially. But from this, we can look at, say, I'll just use the easiest one, skip over a good couple chunks. I did mention obviously Lucy's first kind of big development with like the Force Closures, but with Grand Magic Games Lucy, I think, is the easiest starting point to kind of like gauge how strong Lucy is, because Angel, everybody in the Erasion Sais during their arc, during Nirvana, was S rank. They were S rank in comparison. And when you look at some of like the tiers, you have like the general kind of like foot soldier, you have S rank candidate, you're gonna have S rank, and some of those ranks are obviously really big because there's like a general standing of how powerful it takes to get to this rank, but obviously there are outliers in it. The S ranks have Gildarts, the Wizard Saints have God Serena, the Spriggan have Irene and August. There's just like people at the far end of that tier that just makes the people at the starting point, the low end, obviously look small. But it's like a tier isn't as tight knit as like, oh yeah, this guy is 10% stronger than me, this guy's 10% weaker. It's like, no, some people can just be multiple times more powerful. But as it were, Angel was S-Class. We know that all the Erasion Sais members were S-Class level, both in what was straight said about them, and then in terms of their actual fighting capabilities and what they displayed in their arc. Angel was S-Class, and she could only summon 1 gold key and 1 silver key. This was after, like, Lucy, not even counting, like, her temporary summoning R keys during, the Celestial Spirit King, but actually utilizing them regularly. That was obviously something above her, and that was a display of it, being able to summon 2 spirits at once, though it was not at the potential that would be more valuable, because like the silver keys aren't that strong. Like, what's this, Callum, the chisel? I think he's the only one that's really combative. There's like the Swan from the anime who can do like martial arts stuff, but none of the silver keys are that valuable in a combat sense. They seem to have way more of like an out of combat utility sense. People like Hologram, people like Pixis, but with all that, it shows that Lucy in the Grand Magic Games, after unlocking Second Origin, was up like well within S-Class level, because she had more magic than Angel. She was able to perform Celestial Spirit wizard feats above what Angel was capable of, and we knew that Angel was S-Class. After that point, we saw it in Tartaros. Tartaros is a little bit hard to kind of gauge as well, because Lucy's feats in that are involved with the Celestial Spirit King giving her Aquarius's magic. But we did see, obviously, her magic displayed on board with it, with Aranometria. And, like, one thing to note as well, actually, real quick, with Grand Magic Games, is we know where Natsu was in terms of power. Base Natsu was weaker than Max. So, Natsu, before getting Second Origin, is fodder at the point of the time skip, which, obviously, that makes sense in the long term. But it's, like, at the time of, like, Natsu being below the, like, pretty much the weakest people because of the time skip was a pretty considerable jump for fodder power levels in the series. Like, early on, I'll just mention, early on, like, during, like, the Battle of Fairy Tail, you could see battles between some of, like, the much weaker members destroying buildings. So it's like, okay, these guys at their max, still pretty impressive for, like, random side characters to destroy buildings. And then at the point of, like, the time skip, they're all at level with base Natsu, who, I don't want to get too much into power level specifically, but, you know, this would be, like, multi-city block level, being able to destroy some pretty sizable areas and stuff. But there was a considerable jump. So, like, Lucy jumping up above Angel was obviously pretty considerable. And then after that point, we get to Tartarus, and like I said, it's a little bit harder with that because of the fact that she's boosted by somebody else. It's really hard to kind of gauge a character's feats when it's like, it's an ability that is, like, how they were fighting at the time was not something based off of their own regular ability. There was some form of external source or some, you know, extra bonus thing that came into play. Like, Lucy can't just summon the Celestial Spirit King whatever, and he can't just buff her all the time like that. But it did show, obviously, like, Lucy's threshold of power. Because one thing that is overlooked of Oranometria is it is the highest class spell in the Celestial Spirit line. It is a, I think they said hyper magic initially, which I don't think has ever been mentioned again. But we do know that it is a extremely powerful spell. It's up there with, you know, you would assume with things like Fairy Law. Even if you have a character, say, Laxus in the Fighting Festival, it would still be powerful because, like, Laxus was strong and he is using a high level spell, but obviously Laxus now using it would be, like, to a much greater effect just based off of how much more powerful he is as an individual. It's still strong, but it's like, I'll just use a hypothetical. Say it's like it does triple of what somebody's regular damage is. And then Lucy has her Gemini, so it'd be like if she doubled that, then it's like, oh, 6 times. And obviously, like I said, this triple is just a hypothetical before anyone tries to ask me where specifics came from. But imagine it's like, oh, it does triple damage. And it's like, okay, at this point, Lucy's damage is 3. So it's like, okay, it triples to 9. Whereas, like, maybe now Lucy's damage is 20, so it triples to 60. Something like that, where it kind of scales to you, which is something I think a lot of people don't think about for some reason when it comes to, like, early character things. Like when I had mentioned Natsu being able to no-diff a double of his own attack power, a fire, bounce back, and they'd be like, well, that was the early series Natsu, like, you know, against the Banished Brothers. And it's like, well, why would current Natsu's resistances and stuff not have grown at an equal amount to all his other stats and abilities? It's one of the things that people for some reason just don't understand. It's really weird because it's like, do you think this character's ability in this just never grew from this point? Or it just, like, it'd be so weird. It's like, well, Natsu's resistances and stuff would only be double of what he was at the beginning of the series. It never got bigger. It just doesn't make sense. So for Lucy as well, when you look at, like, her Oranometria, it obviously is absurdly more powerful every single time she gets stronger because it scales with her. So after the point of Tartaros, we get into Alvarez. I think Alvarez made it a little bit easier to understand with the couple parts. One, Lucy seeming pretty confident she could fight base Natsu, and we do see that now. Lucy is definitely stronger than base Natsu. I don't know how Lucy would fare against Lightning Flame Dragon mode Natsu currently. Personally, I think that she could. I think once Natsu goes Fire Dragon King mode, he could just run over her. But I think current Lucy could give Natsu a good fight in Lightning Flame Dragon mode. Because we know that Lucy that's weaker than current Lucy pushed him to Lightning Flame Dragon mode, so above base Natsu. So we'll see how that is. And obviously that's something that goes in her power level. I'll talk about in a bit. But in Alvarez, when she's pretty confident she can fight Natsu a bit. She actually has some pretty good reaction feats against some of her opponents. But in her fight with Brandish, Brandish wasn't going all out. Brandish wasn't taking her too seriously. Brandish was fighting her in a way that was, I would assume, more of like how it would be in the earlier series when, like, Mira Jane, Urza, Gildarts, any of them battled somebody that was at a much younger degree. They're like, I'm not gonna treat you like a child, but obviously I'm not gonna go wild. They're just kind of giving them a good skirmish, because we do see that Brandish does take damage, and the way that I think logically she would sit at this point is Lucy would be somewhere within Wizard Saint level. Because, you know, Wizard Saints can somewhat kind of like mess with some of the Spriggan. You know, well, they're not going all out, obviously. They're not taking you too seriously. But you're within a mess around range with them. Kind of like how like Natsu was to Laxus by himself in the Fighting Festival. Just look at like how Natsu versus Laxus started out. Laxus obviously was more powerful. Natsu was able to get some hits in, but obviously like straight 1-for-1, we saw where the strength was in that. Not even like talking about like how aspects in the story happened later. Gajul coming in for Erlon stuff. Laxus's like mentality, like just entire mental state was just starting to crumble. Just on like the raw power, it was clear that Natsu was strong, but he was still like a good sizable way away from Laxus. But it's not like Laxus was able just to completely speed blitz no diff him. So Lucy was able to fight with Brandish to a degree. Obviously, if Brandish really wanted to, she could have became a 70-mile tall giant, stepped on her, snapped her fingers, blew up Lucy's internal organ, done like some actual crazy OP things if she's like, well, I just want to end this. But again, she did damage her. So it's like, I would assume that maybe like Lucy could put her at mid difficulty, maybe like low to mid difficulty, which again, I think checks with like Wizard Saint level, which makes a lot of sense based off of where she was beforehand. Again, I was gonna say GMG, but it's Grand Magic Games. I can just say because obviously I'm typing. Grand Magic Games S class, somewhere between S class and Wizard Saint level in Tartaros, and then in Alvarez she is within Wizard Saint level, and then logically when we get to 100 Years Quest, she should be somewhere within the low Spriggan level. She was messing with a Spriggan level character before the time skip into the 100 Years Quest. And one of the really good sets of feats that goes with this is during Drasil, Gajul, we were shown that Gajul is comparable somewhat to Natsu. Gajul's problem is that he doesn't have anything above Iron Shadow Dragon mode because he can't activate Dragon Force at will. He doesn't have any equivalent to Fire Dragon King mode. Base Natsu, base Gajul were about equal. Fire Dragon King mode, Lightning Flame Dragon and Iron Shadow Dragon modes were about equal. Natsu was a little bit stronger. I would assume that if he had a higher mode, he would have went into it. Natsu, when it went one level up higher, they would have kept fighting. But for the most part, base Natsu and base Gajul are somewhat around level. Obviously, Natsu should be a good chunk stronger, but they're within range. During the fight with Metro, Gajul and Mirajane both were not able to really harm any of Metro's golems, and Gajul was a little bit worn, obviously, from his fight with Natsu. He was recovering, but like so was Lucy from her battle, so I think that's completely fair. And Mirajane was also there using her base Satan Soul, but at the same time, it's not like she has to go Alegria in order to overtake some of these, and we still don't know if her Tartaros souls are still there since Zeref died. But regardless, she wasn't doing anything. Gajul's attacks weren't hurting the golems, but Lucy in her Taurus dress was able to damage them with her physical strength. And I think that completely makes sense that Taurus, like the Taurus Star Dress, would have more physical strength than base Gajul or Mirajane, because that's all it really is literally just a physical buff. It has no real range outside of Lucy's whip, but it's just literally physical buff strength. And then when she used her Scorpio and Aquarius Stardress mix, her Aqua Storm was able to completely tear through and destroy one. So that obviously shows that her power is stronger than base Gajul and Satan Soul, like base Satan Soul Mirajane by considerable margin. And Gajul, like I said, is already somewhere within level around like base Natsu. So base Natsu and base Gajul should have that. And again, not even like talking about before Elentier, this just makes sense to me because this is Lucy with Taurus dress. So besides if she has some Star Dress mixed with it, this is Lucy's highest physical strength, her Taurus dress. So her buffed highest physical strength being above base Gajul, I think makes complete sense. And then her strongest offensive attack besides Aranometria being able to be above base Gajul and Saint Soul Mirajane, that just makes sense even before you get her Elentier feats. It just there's nobody I think that could get this far and say that it doesn't make sense for Lucy in her physical strongest and one of her highest offensive spells would be below Gajul's base form and Mirajane's lowest form. It's not even going over into like her better feats. It's like you would have to downplay Lucy so much to put her that low that you think that Lucy's upper ceilings in these areas are below these other characters' lowest areas, which again is silly. It's really weird when people kind of like act like Lucy doesn't have any strength whatsoever, act like she's not powerful, and she has fights and she's got feats. And the fight with Mimi, I think, best showed that off. And I think Brandish and Mimi were specifically designed for Lucy. Like, Brandish is kind of like a rival for Lucy somewhat. She's like a weird pseudo rival, but she's set like that as a caster, which I think is obviously to go against Lucy being a caster. But then Mimi is really just a big physical wall. She is just a meathead opponent. She's like a Spriggan level character, but she's not obviously broken like pretty much all the Spriggan are. And like I mentioned, I wanted to get steps up before getting to this portion of the fight. And this took a lot of build up, but it's like, if I did one on Natsu or Gray, people already understand how powerful they are. Whereas, like, I think Lucy's strength is overlooked, and this is the first one I want to do of this series. And I actually really like talking about this, so I definitely want to do more. I've had a lot of video ideas, and I just have been too busy, and I haven't been able to get to them. But this is something that I really want to get to, and talk about some of the fights, and talk about some of the battles, and, like, where characters kind of sit at, and, like, what they came into a fight with, what they came out of a fight with, like, what did they gain, what were their accomplishments. My takes on the battle, because I think this is Lucy's best fight. Lucy's had more emotional battles and more that kind of like do more for her character, but this is way more of a battle for Lucy, and it does stuff for a character, but more in the combat sense, which I do think is important. And I think people overlook that aspect of a series when they act like a character's combat abilities and feats in battle are important because like they don't care about power levels and fights and stuff. But it's like in a battle series that is relevant, because if a character ends up becoming too weak, they're gonna fall behind. Look at Elfman. Elfman is a really good example. He's strong, he's durable, but he's so slow that he can't do anything to like any relevant character. So even if he showed up, unless he gets some speed feats, he's going to literally just be a big, like, bulky snail, and that's not good for people. Like, you can probably think right now of a lot of series where characters fell behind in power levels, and that just because of that, they just fell off, and you never really saw them again, or really saw them do that much. There's a lot of female characters in series, like a lot of the female leads, that happens to, where they just don't really do a lot of combat, and because of that, they don't do a lot in terms of the series. I don't want to hate on Ellie, but Ellie's not a fighter, so I think she's a good example of, like, she had some somewhat combat feats, and then she just didn't really fight, and because of that, she doesn't really have any combat skills. And so in any battle scenario, she just didn't really have a lot of moments where you would see her be that, I don't want to say relevant in the chaotic battle sense. Not, obviously she's important to the story and stuff, but you know what I mean? It's just something that happens, unfortunately, to characters when they fall behind in strength. I think my best example for those who are much closer to me than those who aren't, who have watched Digimon Frontier. If you, I won't go too much deeper into this because I don't want to get sidetracked. But if you watch Digimon from Series 1 to Series 4, I'm not talking about anything beyond that. The main character and his rival always have one level thing above the rest of the cast. Or use the original. The only ones that got Mega. Not even talking about no movies. I'm just talking about the base ones. I don't think anybody else goes Mega except for Tai and oh god, I can't remember his name. I forgot his rival's name for some reason. I remember his face and his voice, but I can't remember his name. But every single rival, they get the highest one, Mega, and then in O2, Ken and Davis both get that evolved version of the DNA digivolving. And then in Tamers, which is definitely my favorite, actually pretty much most of them get Mega, which is one of the reasons I like that one so much. But then look at Frontier, the main character and his rival got their Digimon 2 level. Well, I guess they didn't have Digimon, but their powers and abilities and stuff, 2 levels up. The other characters were stuck with just the human and the beast spirits, whereas like the main character and his rival got the fusion, and then I can't remember exactly their titles, but their ultimate forms is like that, was it Emperor Greymon and Kendo Gurumon, I don't remember the Gurumon form, but you know what I mean? They got 2 levels up. So any relevant bad guys, the other main cast members were so irrelevant they didn't get to really do anything. They would kind of have more character stuff, which is still good, but it's like they didn't get to do much in battle. And obviously that leads to some scenes where they're just not going to get nearly as much spotlight. And so that happens a lot of the time in other series, and I really am happy that Mishima has kept all the cast members relevant in terms of strength up, like even at this point. And Lucy has been able to keep up as well. So going into Elentier, because I mentioned in Drasil, Lucy had some feats in comparison to like Gajul and Mary Jane, but then in Elentier, we see some really good displays. And in the Mimi fight has 2 rounds for Lucy, and it's not the same as like Yoka or Hakune, where Urza in the first one was having issue because obviously spiritual arts magic gap, and then wasn't able to mess with her abilities. And then in the second round, she was able to kind of like just see through her tricks at that point and then just beat her. With Gray was able to utilize more of his double slaying side, resistance to ice, superior ice freezing abilities, superior combat abilities. He just was able to pretty much figure out the best way to combat his opponent, whereas like Lucy's hat was the main, I think, meat out of those fights. And it's because, as I mentioned, I wanted to go over something about Mimi, because I think Mimi's a silly character. Like, that's just a fact. Every single bad guy group, Mishima has one of them be a little silly, just be a little bit comedic. You know, you can look at people like Kei Nakaru, Franmoth, Hot Eye, Jacob, Mad Mole, Doom, who, like, even right now, you can kind of look at Haku. Haku's a little silly, but you know what I mean. There's always one that is a little bit more comedic in their grouping, and that's Mimi for the Moonlight Divinities. With Mimi, though, she's definitely strong, and I mentioned with the Brandish fight, she was able, like, Lucy's able to give Brandish a pretty fair battle, but when Lucy used Aquametria, with Brandish, it pushed her back, it did some damage, but Brandish was able to compress it, overtake it, and shoot it back. Whereas Mimi just ate it. Mimi literally drank it. So keep in mind the damage level that Lucy's putting out, not even going to mention power level specifically. Think about, like, she throws this attack out. This attack has a certain level of power. It's so below Mimi that Mimi's internal organs aren't hurt by it. Think of like water, and like when water's pressurized and like how powerful it can become, how dangerous like water actually is if you put enough force behind it. That level of power didn't even scratch Mimi's throat. Like, Mimi just drinks it, no problem. And she's again able to not only overpower Taurus Dress Lucy, but Taurus Dress Lucy and Taurus. Because Mimi should easily be the same level as people like Yoko and Hakune, who are hard fights. Well, not hard, but I'd say like upper to mid fights with Natsu and not Natsu. Natsu didn't really fight it. Natsu didn't really get a battle in Elentier, but with Gray and Urza, and they were able, like, these were second rounds. No, they lost the first rounds pretty much just because of they don't have as many like direct hacks, like unfair abilities as obviously Yoko and Hakune have, but it's way more of like a easy comparison when you look at where Mimi is and say like, oh, Mimi should be on level with these characters, they're in the same grouping. And on top of that, Mimi already has feats, again, like with like things like Aquametria with Taurus, that show that she has the feats to actually hold up at this level. Now, when Lucy went in the first time, keep in mind, Lucy should be around low Spriggan level based off of feats from, you know, Yggdrasil with Gajul, Mirajane and stuff, Aqua Storm, and her Taurus Dress physical strength. In terms of feats, she should be around low Spriggan level at that point. Now, a low Spriggan level character, again, and a mid-level Spriggan character like Mimi, obviously, Mimi is stronger, but it's not like Mimi is so overwhelmingly beyond Lucy in terms of, like, look at someone like Acnologia and God Serena, or Celine and Georg, where it's just like, I could literally no-diff kill you at any point. It's not that giant of a gap. It's like, she can clearly win, but Lucy can at least try to fight back. And then in the second round, Lucy gets boosted from critical magic and stuff. Lucy's fighting her, and she's able to do more. She's able to push back more against her. She's able to use her star dresses to fight her more intelligently, like using the Speak a Hole to go down into the ground and then use the momentum coming up to punch harder, to double her attacks. And as well as the smartest thing, I think, in her fights, and is now the most dangerous thing for a Lucy opponent going into other battles, is the fact that Lucy, when she fought Mimi, and it's probably my favorite part, I think, of the fight, because it's smart. It's so smart. It's like when she summoned Gemini at the start just to kind of like double her kicking power to land an attack on Mimi. She had Gemini. She didn't like dismiss Gemini, because you only see her really summoning like one spirit after that point and using star dresses kind of like just regularly. But she has Gemini as her stand in the back and cast Oranometria. The thing about Oranometria, obviously, that's its weakness, is that it's a chant. And obviously, like there's the fact that if you're way faster than your opponent, obviously you can just get it off. But it's like that would still not change the fact that in a fight that's relevant to you, a character at your level or maybe above, a chant is a hindrance, because at that point, the character you're going to be fighting speed is going to be like, they're going to be fast enough to react to you, and a chant is going to be something that is going to take a while to do. Lucy does have the whole water shields, but that's not, it's a strong defense, but it's not like an impossible to overcome defense. If you have the right ability, you can kind of probably just like cheat nope that. Again, most characters at this point have at least one Hax ability that they can utilize. So, if that Hax can overcome Lucy's ability, then she can get screwed in that point. But having Gemini cast it in the back is really smart. And on top of that, Gemini doing it, being out, means that Lucy can double the power of it. So it not only is it pretty much a like back row cast, where you're just pretty much putting it behind you, just like keeping up with your opponent, fighting them so they can't, they're not paying attention to that. And then doubling its power is a really good way to just in general fight. There's like some combos with Lucy's ability that can make her so dangerous. And I'm even talking about like now that she can just summon all of her spirits at the same time. Like, I would assume that she can still do that, just because like there's nothing that would indicate that they got weaker after leaving Elentier. Like, it would be really weird to kind of like give Lucy that buff and then take everything away from her. Like, maybe she can only summon half, maybe she can summon all of them. But I feel like at least as of right now, we can assume that she can summon all of them. I don't think it's relevant though in this fight, because I don't think she needs to summon all of her spirits, really, when you kind of like look at what she actually did to win the fight. But having all these spirits, let's just look at the idea of like just 2 spirits, because I don't need to prove that she can just have 2 spirits. That obviously she does all the time. She can theoretically summon Gemini and Leo, have Gemini turn into her, summon 2 more spirits. At that point, you have 3 frontline spirits. You have Gemini for a double, you have Gemini for defense. You can have Ares come out, and then someone like Capricorn or Sagittarius. So you could have Leo direct melee fight, Sagittarius ranged cover, Ares defense, as well as like the hacks of her wool, and then have a double powered Oranometria sitting in the back, while Lucy also star dresses herself into, say, like Aquarius to put up the water shield. Lucy has a lot of busted combos that if she really like it really flex like what she could do. That's like the terror that she actually has. Whereas like she's never done that specifically, but the Oranometria like backcast is one of the things that theoretically Lucy would be able to do, and has now done it. And not only did it, she did it at the start of her second round with Mimi, which I think is the important thing about her fight, is because in the second round, Lucy flexed way more, not just like an increase in power, but using her star dresses more intelligent. Not even just star dresses, using like the specific abilities of her arsenal more intelligently. Because the difference between Lucy and, say, really the rest of her cast, is that she has the most diverse set of abilities. Now look at Wendy. Wendy's enchants obviously have a lot of utility, but it's like she doesn't have the widespread range of, say, Lucy. And Urza's armors and swords, like they all have their own kind of thing, but they're not as like strict widespread as Lucy's. Like most of her armors have one-trick abilities or resistances, or her weapons will generally just have a damage effect or some form of elemental attribute. Nothing too crazy. Whereas like when you really look at like all the different strange abilities Lucy has, suddenly becoming an archer, suddenly gaining physical strength, suddenly being able to give herself martial arts and resistances to ocular abilities, wool for like defense, as well as like spirit drain or spirit to fight draining hacks. You have the Speak of Holes, as well as the momentum behind it. You have light abilities. With Hologram, she has like pretty much like a 1-up. It'll auto save her once from a death in a fight. Yeah, you have people like obviously the absurd flexibility of Gemini. There's just a lot to Lucy's arsenal that can be dangerous if she utilized it in its full. And obviously this fight with Mimi, I think was her best fight because of the first round, seeing like, you know, obviously the level of difference between the first and the second, but obviously the gap in her abilities and how she was using them. Because like, say the towards scene was the best part, I think, in just like the general gap when she was just, oh, I'll just physical strength, oh, it's not working, I'll just double like the physical strength pretty much being put into it, which is still, I mean, it's still something that's not like, it's not dumb, but it's like at that point, like, why are you trying to fight her at what she's good at? Fight her what you're good at. And then in the second round, Lucy was doing that, being able to pretty much just quick dodge all of Mimi's attacks by going to the ground. Because like the thing about Virgo we've always seen is Virgo herself is not a fighter, but her speed in digging is actually like really fast. She'll just kind of like bolt into the ground and then she's just done. So like Lucy instead using that for like an escape, but then also using that for like an enhanced attack, using the momentum to kind of fly up and attack people, is really smart. Like she's gained a lot of, I think, respect in her own abilities to use them again more in the best that she can output them as. So now I think Lucy is on the way of pretty much being the most optimal fighter as a Celestial Spirit Wizard. And on top of that, she's got more abilities to gain. I mean, the fact that she has Stardress Mix makes me wonder, like, could she eventually do 3? Could she do 4? Is she eventually going to be able to imbue herself with all of her dresses at once? Because that would obviously make her really broken. But it's like, if she can do 2 at once, what's stopping her from doing 3 at once? What's stopping her from doing 4? She's not doing anything really that crazy. All she's really doing is, like, she's just taking in the magic of her keys. So if she can do 2 at the same time, theoretically, she should eventually be able to learn, again, 3. She can summon 1 spirit, then 2 spirits. You summon 3 spirits, multiple spirits. It just comes down to the point of, obviously, Lucy's strength capacity, which is growing. Because the thing that, again, is very not, I think, thought about in terms of current Lucy is when you look at her feats, current Lucy beating Mimi is the same kind of like around area as Urza and Gray beating Mimi. The only thing that, their opponents obviously beating Mimi obviously would be, I would say, depending on how they approach them, probably a lot better than Lucy in the second round, but Lucy's, or first round, Lucy's second round, a different story. But look at how those fights went. Lucy is within range of Urza and Gray now. She's still weaker than them, because when you look at their fights, Lucy is everything. She pretty much just barely was able to overtake Mimi, whereas like Gray and Urza, after they kind of like got over their opponent's tricks, was able to beat them with like a mid-level of difficulty, which again makes a lot of sense. Lucy, like, that's one of the things that I think is overlooked and really oddly overlooked. Is again, a lot of like these levels for like Lucy's strength make a lot of sense. It's not like Lucy suddenly is on level with Irene or August, where she could no diff Gray. It's like, no, her max being a chunk. Like, think about it like this. In terms of like, say, numbers, like if Gray and Urza were like an 8, Lucy's maybe like a 6.5. Like, I think that just makes a lot of sense. Like, Lucy logically wouldn't be nothing to them at this point, because then it'd be like, what does Lucy do in the 100 Years quest? She has feats for keeping up. She has feats for combat. She has feats to display that she is a very skilled fighter for her abilities. She just hasn't gotten to the point, I think, where a lot of people outright are like looking at her strength and saying, like, yeah, she's really powerful. Not necessarily, but in terms of like straight like a fighter. And I think if she could, I'm hoping she gets her rematch with Kyria, because that's something I didn't really consider too much until going into this arc, about a rematch with them, because she obviously did have a battle with her in Elmina, but you know, Lucy couldn't really do anything. Whereas like now, I think Lucy could beat Kyria with like mid difficulty right now. Because as far as I know, Kyria didn't get stronger, Lucy did get stronger, and Lucy, I don't think that Kyria would be able to do anything after the point of like Aranometria goes off. Like, I don't think she's getting back up from that. She doesn't seem to have the durability for it. As logically speaking as well, because like I've mentioned, going up into this, where current Lucy sits at, again, the hypothetical, Urza's an 8, Lucy's a 6.5. Don't even don't take that for stone soul, but just like the idea, obviously, of Lucy within range. Lucy's strongest attack doubled is no way below base Lox's not even doing enough to break a sweat. It was his Roaring Thunder, but I do not believe casual base Laxus, maybe not casual, but kind of like a little bit kind of still casual, because it was like an upper technique, but it was at a point where he's not even putting that much energy into it. That Laxus, there's no way that attack is stronger than doubled Aronometria Lucy. I don't think that whatsoever. Obviously, full power Lax is a different story, because I gotta bring up, or somebody who's gonna get mad at me for putting Laxus and Lucy in terms of like an attack power in some conversation, but it's like in the context of like, yeah, this attack, there's no way that this one wouldn't defeat her. Because I don't believe for a second someone like Mimi, who's literally built to be a tank, who's literally designed to be a brick wall, is less durable than Kyria. I don't believe that whatsoever. Kyria so far has been shown, at least to me, the least durable Dragon Eater. She seemed, again, that makes sense because she's specifically a Blade Dragon Slayer, whereas like Madmole's the armor, so it's like she should have higher offense, less defense, and he should have more defense, less offense. So, going through all this, kind of finishing this up, I just wanted to kind of like talk more about it. I mean, it's more about Lucy in general, because like the fight itself, I didn't even talk more about like the battle in terms of like how it specifically was, because in terms of a fight, it's not that crazy. It's not like a complicated match where it's like Gray, you have to go into stuff with like his resistances to the cold, the ice, like more of like Slayer out, like adaptability to whatever their attribute is. Gray utilizing more of that as he did in Drasil, but in this case he's using more of its adaptive abilities to ice to overcome Hakune's whole gamut of abilities, and then going into like Urza, where Urza was just kind of like overlooking her, pretty much getting past her tricks, and then it's like, well, for some reason Yoko's like, well, I'll just challenge like this, not knowing who she's really up against, and then was defeated. It was way more of an easy to understand fight, but at the same time it was more set to be a widespread battle than the other ones. Like for the most part, again, it's Lucy doing like some combo attacks, fighting more intelligently, and then smart casting her Aronometria. Because the other battles, I think they're more about the characters, but this one has more, I think, to talk about, because there's not nearly as much interaction between Hakune and Gray or Yoko and Urza. There's way more interaction just between Lucy and Mimi that give us a nice back and forth dynamic between them as adversaries in this fight. There's way more banter between them, and there's way more kind of like character content going back and forth between them as well. So Lucy in this fight, like I said early on, this is Lucy's best fight in terms of a battle. This isn't Lucy's best fight for emotions. Her best like emotional scene is probably beating Jackal, whereas this is more for Lucy's combat perspective, more like Lucy's combat area of like skills and abilities in her character. She did gain character development in this, but I think the big meat of this fight was way more of Lucy in terms of, again, her ability to fight. Because even her upset and stuff with her character was in her combat abilities in this. And I think that was good, because Lucy didn't need to have another like stuff with like her dad, or like some way more kind of like tied to her emotional setup, with other characters or something in the large scale story. Whereas like I think something way more home and personal to her in terms of literally just her fighting capabilities was good, because it did focus again on her combat and then get her set up, I think, for the Doggermag Labyrinth. Whereas like now I think she's way more commendable in her ability to fight going against like these other characters. So like looking at where Lucy's at now, if say she beats Kyria, I think now it makes way more sense than like if she didn't have all her stuff in Elentier and then just went from like Elmina losing to Doggermag like beating her. Whereas like now I do think that she would win without a whole lot of difficulty, but we'll see. I mean, Kyria obviously is crazy, and I would assume, has more to her than what she's shown. But again, that's up to speculation. So outside of that, comment below, tell me your thoughts about this, because I want to do more ones where it's like I can talk about specifics in the battle, but this one was way more kind of just one of those less talking, more fighting kind of areas. Because I think the only part really in the second match is kind of the grasp on how she underestimated Lucy. Because the first round is way more kind of like setting up, obviously, Lucy's grasp on her own strength and her upset that she was not strong enough to beat Mimi. Mimi doesn't really have anything crazy for abilities again. Like this is a weird one because it's like the fight itself is way more in content to talk about, like Lucy's abilities in a fight, Lucy's growth in her stats and in feats and stuff. Whereas like it's way less of one that you're gonna talk about each area in battle, because for the most part the areas in battle aren't that kind of crazy. Even in the second round, Lucy's like I'd say like Lucy's biggest talking point is the fact that she set up Uranometria in the back. I mean, she did do some smart stuff like summoning Aquarius and then having like Aquarius do this big water attack, and that caused Mimi to go and drink water, you know, causing a distraction on top of this back casting of Uranometria. And we do also see some good durability feats, like maybe when Mimi's like straight attacking her and Lucy's like getting hit by these, but kind of like bracing herself. Being able to keep going and fighting. Even when Mimi grabs her by the leg and throws her against like a cliff and smashes her into it, Lucy is able to use her whip, go over and grab part of the building, pull herself over to it, and I said someone coming out darn like right near the end, and of course I'm gonna end up coughing, but I was able to just barely overcome it. But when she's like fighting her and she's able to do this is just a really good again general display of Lucy's combative skills. And I know like the Aquarius one was a smart thing because it was a distraction, and it also not only distracted her, but once Mimi drank all that water, she had a bunch of water in her body, so she was slowed down a little bit. And I thought that was pretty cool because again, that's smart. She's not a Dragon Slayer where she can just convert her attribute and what she eats into her, her abilities. I guess say magic is spiritual arts for her specifically. But then Lucy goes and uses Uranometria and is able to defeat Mimi. Like, there's the cool part at the very end, the fact that Mimi was still standing, but I mean, that's just because Mimi obviously wanted to pass out on her feet. Lucy did win, but just barely. So, I kind of like general, like, grasp at this whole battle. I really like the first and second round because it's not like it's setting up a rival for Lucy. It's a weird one because it's not like, I'll use, for example, Grimmjow and Bleach. When Grimmjow showed up and just completely ran over Ichigo, it was obviously setting him up as like a rival opponent. With Mimi, it wasn't to set up a rival character, and it's not to like have some big enemy, it's not to build on some like way longer set personal kind of like emotional backstory stuff. It's like specifically Lucy and her ability to fight. Like this way more structured specifically on Lucy's combat abilities, and that's the thing I think is the most interesting thing about this fight, because this fight, it's not like with the Jackal one where it's like Jackal I would talk about obviously like stuff about like Lucy's like emotional spot in this one, what she gained out of it, how I think a straight fight with them would go. There's way more in this one specifically about Lucy's combat skills, her stats, her feats, where she kind of goes into this fight, where she comes out of this fight, and how she utilizes her magic in this one. Because that's the biggest thing, obviously, I think in this second round, is how exactly Lucy is using each of these abilities to fight this opponent. She's using them way more intelligently of like, how can I use this ability to my advantage instead of like, I'll use this ability and then figure it out as I'm fighting them. Lucy's just being way more of a tactical fighter. And I think that's one of the things I really wanted to kind of like emphasize going into this one, because the reason I wanted to start with this one out of any of the battles for my channel, and I actually really want to start about some of the other fights, but like this one I want to do specifically first because we're getting into the Dodonrmag Labyrinth, and I think this one is important to have like pretty much set up on the side, because out of all the characters, I think Lucy will be the most underestimated going into this arc. So like if people want to kind of like remember how strong she is or understand how strong she is, they just go to this video and they can listen to, for the most part, just kind of like displays and kind of like talking arounds of Lucy's abilities. Because again, the first thing I wanted to go over in this was, okay, well, how strong was Lucy going into this fight? And I gave a couple examples, a couple steps Whereas, like, now Lucy is strong enough again to go against some of these opponents. Obviously, she's not going to be fighting the Black Dragon Slayer Knights, but I think people like Kyria, Madmol, she should have a mid-level of difficulty fighting. I would rather her fight Kyria for the rematch, because I don't really know what the Madmol fight would be. The Madmol fight would literally just be emphasizing and like display what Madmol's abilities are, because otherwise it would just be the Mimi fight over again. This big, immovable physical strength brick wall that she just has to automatically cast and do the damage on. But anyway, other than that, comment below, thumbs up the video, friend, like, subscribe, and tell me what your comments and your thoughts are about this fight. When it comes to like the next fight, I'll talk way more about like the specific steps, but like this one I think was more important to go over again, specifically Lucy's combat abilities, like how strong she is, her and Mimi, because I don't even have anything to really talk about when it comes to Mimi's abilities. Like Mimi's only thing besides what she kind of displayed was her physical strength, was like the weird Mimi Hurricane where she's like spinning hard enough to pretty much make a small hurricane around her, and then using her fighting spirit to levitate. There's not that craziness of Mimi to really talk about. She's just a fun character with very basic abilities, just very high level basic abilities, but just designed to be a physical fighter against a caster, a summoner caster in this case, and pretty much Lucy's worst opponent like that you could have outside of just getting to like a stronger Bard Hollow who just says no spirits for you. But anyway, other than that, comment below, thumbs up the video for like, but subscribe and check out my other videos. But that, for sharing desires, subscribe, and thank you all for listening. Bye.